Good morning. Thank you for being with us here today for a press conference with our NDP whip, Rachel Blaney, and our NDP critic for finance, Daniel Blaikie. Bonjour, merci de nous rejoindre ce matin pour une conférence de presse avec le whip du NPD, Rachel Blaney, et la porte-parole en matière de finances, Daniel Blaikie. We will have a period of questions at the end. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone from beautiful British Columbia, and thank you for being here. We're here to talk about the cost of living and the impacts that it's having across Canada. We know that in this environment where we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, a lot of us are focused on those issues, and we should be. But at the same time, we know that Canadians every day are facing challenges that are growing by the day. We've heard from so many Canadians that are talking about barely being able to cover their bills, not being able to put food on the table, and falling further behind. It's really concerning to me because we know that the Liberal government has been in power now over 6 years, and we're still not seeing the action that they keep promising. We're seeing Walmart get billions of dollars in profit, Canadian Tire making billions of dollars in profit, and we know that 60% of Canadians don't know if they'll be able to put food on the table. I'm hearing in my riding, and in fact across Canada, of people. I think of one person who has a very good paying job, but because of how high the cost of housing has become, she was bumped out of her house because somebody was selling it because they wanted to get that profit. She's living with her partner who has a severe disability in an RV, hoping that the expense of living in a park doesn't overcome them in the summer. I'm hearing from parents who aren't able to feed their children, who are going to food banks more and more and having to go online to beg people for food. So as we look at these realities, as we see housing markets, we think of Victoria, the capital of British Columbia here, in the last 6 years, over 90% increase in cost. I live in a rural and remote riding. Some of my smallest communities have seen the housing costs go up by 70%. So what happens, of course, is that people are selling their rental units because they can finally make a really amazing profit, which means more and more people are without a home. So we're seeing the homelessness population increase. We're seeing people who have good paying jobs not able to find anywhere to live. And we're also hearing from businesses who are desperately trying to hire people because they're trying to come back from COVID and really grow the opportunities that they're seeing, but they cannot hire people because there's literally nowhere for them to live. So we're calling on the government to take action finally and stop talking, but really address the key issues of getting people what they need. And what they need is housing, and they need life to be more affordable. They need to really see action on cell phone bill costs, and they need to finally take the step that they need to take, which is to tax the wealthiest people in this country who are making enormous profits, have gone through COVID, and instead of suffering like the majority of Canadians, have made even more money. We have to look at fairness across this country. We have to make sure that people are safe and stable. And what we're seeing is a government that keeps supporting their rich friends and not supporting everyday Canadians who are crying out for help. And these are not people that are waiting for a handout. These are people that are working hard every single day to make ends meet. I leave it to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So, we're in this context where people are really feeling pinched. They're feeling pinched because the cost of housing is going up. They're feeling pinched because the cost of groceries is going up. And, recent polling is telling us there's been a couple out now that, as high as 60% of Canadians are now worried about being able to put food on their table and are feeling very much like even small economic misfortunes at their family level could result in really tragic consequences. And we're hearing stories of people that are losing their homes, that can't afford to make it anymore. And we have to do something about that. It's not sustainable to continue to watch so many people fall further and further behind. It's ruining lives in Canada, and it's also going to result in a massive expense as people fall into homelessness. It's far more expensive from the point of view of a social system to try and maintain people in homelessness than it is to maintain them in a home. The thing about maintaining them in a home, though, is that you have to do planning and you have to make investments. And that's really the message of the NDP, is that we need to be investing in people in this time. And instead, we've seen the opposite of that. This is really the first wave of the pandemic where there hasn't been any meaningful direct financial support to Canadians. The Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit has been very difficult for people to access. And for those who can access it, the rate is no longer $2,000 a month, it's $300 a month. Now, at the same time, prices are going up, the financial support of government is going down, and what it's doing is exposing all of these things that have been at work for a very long time. 6 years, certainly the 6 years that Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister, and longer. Housing prices have been going up for a long time. And that's why it's so important that we need to invest urgently in increasing housing supply, not just more houses on the market for sale in the kind of commodity market that residential housing has become, but non-market housing units, whether those are co-op units or whether those are units managed by non-profit organizations that have rent subsidies to make sure that people's rent is proportionate to their income, so that they can stay housed through these difficult economic times. It means capping cell phone and internet bills, because that's not a luxury that people are enjoying. It's part of how you search for work in a challenging economy where people have been losing employment as some things are affected by the pandemic, and have to seek new work, either in the same industry or in a different industry. But in the modern economy, you can't do that if you don't have access to the internet and you don't have a phone. We can't kid ourselves about that. So these are essential things that Canadians need. When it comes to seniors, they're still struggling with the cost of their prescription drugs. That's not a new pandemic issue. That's something that's been going on for a long time. And the terrible shame is that Canada continues to pay more to pharmaceutical companies for prescription drugs every year than it would cost to run a national pharmacare program. So that's not only a place where we can help people in their individual budgets and expand access to important preventative medical care as well as treatment, but we can also do it while saving Canadians money overall in their and their government's money, at a time when we need to free up cash to be able to reinvest in other parts of our health system that's been under so much strain as a result of the pandemic. And there are ways that we can pay for this, that the Liberals continue to pass up. One of the things that Rachel was just talking about was some of the companies that have made huge profits during the course of the pandemic, over and above the profits that they were making in the pre-pandemic era. So look at some of the grocery chains, for instance, that have seen huge increases in their profits. These are companies that ought to be paying more on those extra profits. And that's why New Democrats have been very proud to be the only ones in the House of Commons to suggest having an excess profits tax, a temporary tax for the pandemic context that recognizes that companies who are making a lot more benefiting from the pandemic economy really ought to be paying a higher share of that extra money back into the system that has done so well for them as a business at the expense of Canadians who are really struggling to get by. It's why we need to talk about things like a wealth tax, because if you look at the numbers, the people that already had a lot of wealth going into the pandemic were able to grow it substantially during the pandemic, while others are just struggling to hang on. Here in Manitoba, in the Christmas season, we saw an increase at food banks of 70%, a 70% increase in the instances of people using food banks in order to be able to make sure that they could put food on the table. That's a giant increase. And as I say, I think it's related to the increase in prices, but it's also related to the government deciding to turn its back on Canadians and restrict access to pandemic benefits by lowering the amount and making it harder for people to qualify for pandemic benefits in the first place. And that's what's so distinctive about the Omicron wave from an economic point of view. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at the end of that wave, we're seeing people in such dire straits, particularly as inflation continues to eat up what little bit of spending power people do have. Alors, merci beaucoup pour être ici. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour parler du vraie pression subie par les Canadiens et Canadiennes parce que nous avons d'une part les prix qui continuent à monter pour le logement, pour les épiceries, et de l'autre part, nous avons subi avec Omicron la première vague où il n'y avait pas vraiment une forte appui financière pour les Canadiens et Canadiennes directement du gouvernement fédéral. Alors, cette combinaison d'un manque d'appui financier et des prix qui haussissent fait en sorte que les Canadiens et les Canadiennes ont vraiment un temps difficile à acheter leurs épiceries et payer leur loyer. Et ça met l'emphase sur des grands problèmes qui existent depuis 6 ans et plus. Alors, pendant toute la période du gouvernement Trudeau et même avant, par rapport au logement, il n'y a pas assez de logements et le logement qui existe est trop cher. Alors, nous avons besoin d'un investissement en construire plus de logements et de logements abordables, pas seulement plus de logements dans le marché libre, mais des coopératives et d'autres méthodes de construire et gérer le logement. Et nous avons besoin des mesures et des politiques du gouvernement fédéral qui peut baisser les prix dans le marché privé pour le logement aussi. Nous avons besoin des règlements pour les prix de l'Internet et pour le coût des cellulaires et d'autres choses dont nous avons parlé depuis longtemps comme l'NPD. Et tout ça pourrait être fait si on demande finalement aux plus riches de payer leur juste part avec une taxe supplémentaire ou une taxe sur les profits supplémentaires du pandémie, avec une wealth tax, comme on dit en anglais, sur les plus riches et d'autres mesures qui pourraient nous donner comme gouvernement assez de revenus pour être là pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes. Alors, merci beaucoup de votre attention.
So we'll turn it over to a period of questions now. I would just ask anyone who has a question to please use the raise hand function. We'll have one question and one follow-up. On va voir une période de questions. Je vous demande d'utiliser la fonction lever la main et on va prendre une question et une question suivie. Marie Wolf from the Canadian Press.
Thanks. I couldn't find the little button there. Sorry, I had to do it the old-fashioned way. So what I wondered about was obviously the invasion of Ukraine will have reverberations on the international economy. And I wondered if you were concerned about that, not just with relation to oil, but also they're a huge supplier of wheat. And now, of course, Canada is quite self-sufficient in that regard, but there are other countries, particularly in the Middle East, which rely very heavily on Ukrainian wheat. And I know this is slightly outside your métier, but I wondered if you could comment on that and whether Canadians and other people around the globe should be bracing themselves for, hard times ahead, even harder times ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that there are likely to be serious economic consequences that are felt across the world as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. What I would say is that it makes it all the more important that the government here in Canada, knowing that people are already struggling, act quickly on the things that it can control. So there are a lot of things going on in the global economy right now that we understand aren't up to the Canadian government, but there are things at home that can really help Canadians deal with those things that its government can't control. So lowering the price of prescription drugs through a national pharmacare program can make a difference for Canadians now and help reduce those costs. Capping cell phone and internet bills can help control Canadians' monthly costs. Taking real action in the housing market, both on the policy side to help bring down prices, but also on the investment side to create new non-market housing alternatives, are going to help bring down the cost of housing and make affordable housing more accessible. That means that when there are economic impacts that we have less control over as a country, that's easier, not easy, but easier for Canadians to absorb because their government is taking action on the things that it can make an impact on. And that's why this Liberal inaction on these problems that, as we said before, are not new problems. These are problems that predate the pandemic. It's why it's that much more important that the government get acting on them now, because we know Canadians are going to need some more wiggle room in their budget, unfortunately, to try and deal with these larger global economic challenges. And so we need a government that's going to help them to do that by acting on the things that it can act on. And there are so many things that we've known about for so long that government could be doing. There's really no more time to wait. Canadians have absorbed pretty much as they can in their individual budgets. It's time for collective solutions, and that requires public leadership.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that we are in a crisis, and we were before the pandemic, we were seeing it, and we're definitely seeing it after the couple of years of the pandemic. And of course, now when we see what's happening in Ukraine, the impacts will be more profound. And I just want to come back to housing, because I think, when I look in my region and across so much of Canada, what we're seeing is people who cannot afford rent, people who can never even begin to dream of purchasing a home. And when we see the housing market increase in that way, it means hardworking people, young people in particular, who are wanting to build their future, are looking at the future and saying, I won't be able to buy a home. I probably should really consider if I'm going to have a family, because they can't sort of have those basic needs met. And so this is something that has been an issue in this country for a very long time. And inaction, government after government, has put us in a place of such crisis that we now have people who are making good incomes, who are living, in substandard housing. They're living in a fifth wheel, down the way in a park. And that's not the vision of the world that they wanted to have. So at some point it's going to fall apart. And we're asking the government to listen to Canadians, to listen to their lived experience, to listen to the high number of people who are going to the food bank just to get enough food to eat, to finally take action and stop talking about it, but do that action. And finally, make sure that the disparity between the wealthy, the middle income, and the poor is just growing every year. So, it's time for the government to stand up for hardworking people and say, we're going to do this better, because it's not right that the ultra wealthy are compounding their wealth every day while hardworking people are losing every opportunity.
Thanks for that. Can I just ask as a follow-up? I mean, everyone's obviously concentrating on Ukraine, and I just wondered, I mean, the NDP's been fairly firm in demanding sanctions and other action. But for individual Canadians, would you support people boycotting Russian goods very much like they did in South Africa in protest?
Well, I think a lot of Canadians are standing up. They're asking questions of our federal government as well, to make sure that we're being accountable in every way that we can. I have to say, people are really being horrified and moved by what's happening. They're seeing people flee. We've seen this before, but it just feels like more of a risk because of the power of Russia. So I think a lot of Canadians are looking at this, and I think we need to all be accountable for where things we buy come from and what kind of world we want to be in. And, you know, as a person who believes fundamentally in creating an environment of peace, we need to hold people to account. We need to make sure that there's as much humanitarian aid in place for every person who is fleeing for sanctuary in this planet. And of course, especially with Ukraine in this dire circumstance, we need to see those visas removed so that people can come here as quickly as possible.
Just a reminder, if you have a question, to use the raise hand function. I'm not seeing any other questions at this time, so this will conclude our press conference.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Everyone.